Part 1. The house I once called home. When I close my eyes, I can still feel that day, the chill in the air, the smell of old wood and dust, and the silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that calms you, it was the kind that screams inside your chest. That morning, I came home after running a few errands. The street was quiet, the garden still looked the same, but as I walked up the driveway, I saw something that made my heart stop. Boxers, all of my things, neatly packed, labeled, stacked outside the porch like I was being moved out of my own life. There was a small white envelope taped to the door, my name written in my son's handwriting. I smiled faintly at first, thinking maybe it was some kind of misunderstanding, or a surprise, but when I opened it, I read 6 words that shattered everything inside me. Sorry, Mom, no space for you anymore. I stood there, frozen. The words didn't sink in at once. They hung in the air like cold fog, blurring everything I thought I knew about love, family, and home. I had raised that boy with my bare hands, held him through fevers, celebrated his wins, carried his sorrows, and now I was a stranger outside the door I once opened for him. I didn't scream, I didn't knock, I just stood there, watching my reflection in the window. It looked like someone else's life, someone else's tragedy. I sat on the bench near the mailbox until sunset. My neighbors walked by, they waved, smiled, didn't ask. Maybe they didn't see the heartbreak in my eyes. Or maybe they did, and chose to pretend they didn't. As the streetlights flickered on, I picked up a small bag, just one. Inside it were some clothes, my old diary, and a framed photo of my husband holding our baby boy. That photo was all I had left of the home that was now locked from the inside. That night I didn't go to any friend's house. I didn't want sympathy or explanation. I sat in the park, under a quiet lamp, watching the fog drift across the grass. The city was alive, but my world had gone still, and there, in that stillness, I began to remember everything. Every little sign I ignored. The way my daughter-in-law Kayla had slowly taken over everything. The bills, the paperwork, the house keys. The way my son Brandon stopped calling me Mom and started calling me Ma'am. It all made sense now. People think betrayal happens suddenly, but it doesn't. It starts small, in the quiet moments, the unspoken changes, the polite lies, and before you know it, you're standing outside your own life, wondering how it all slipped away. The next morning, I found myself back on the same street. From a distance, I saw them, Brandon and Kayla, standing in the doorway, laughing, holding coffee mugs. The home looked complete, but I was no longer a part of that picture. I wanted to walk up, to ask why, but I stopped, because I knew the woman standing there wasn't the same mother who had given everything. She was someone new now, someone who had lost everything, and yet had one thing left, her silence. And in that silence, I found something powerful, something that whispered, this isn't the end, not yet. That night, as I opened my old diary, a paper slipped out, an old property deed, signed long ago. And for the first time in months, I smiled, because maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't over. Asterisk, asterisk, part 2. The truth beneath the dust. I sat at the old desk in my tiny studio that night, the same one where I used to paint when Brandon was little. The air smelled like turpentine and memories. The house was small, but quiet, and that quiet gave me room to think. The paper that had fallen from my diary lay open before me. It was the original property deed of the house, the home I had built with my late husband, and right there, in faded ink, was my name, Margery Elaine Carter, sole owner. For a moment, I didn't know whether to cry or laugh. They had thrown me out of a house that still legally belonged to me. How ironic, how painfully poetic. I traced my fingers over my husband's signature. He had signed it 25 years ago, the day we made our biggest dream come true, a home for our family. And now, that same home had become the stage of my betrayal. But that paper reminded me, I wasn't helpless. I wasn't finished. The next morning, I visited my old friend Martina. She was always the one who told me the truth, even when I didn't want to hear it. When I showed her the deed, she looked at me, her eyes widening. Margery, she said softly, they can't legally do this to you. Her voice trembled, but mine didn't, because for the first time in months, I felt something strong inside me, a quiet kind of fire. Martina took me to meet Mr. Ashby, a lawyer she trusted. He was kind, calm, and direct. After reading the documents, he looked up and said, Mrs. Carter, you own that property, completely. If anyone tried to transfer it without your consent, that's fraud. Fraud, Such a small word for such a heavy sin, but it fit. He explained everything, the legal steps, the letters, the evidence. I listened carefully, my hands clasped, my heart steady. I wasn't driven by revenge, I just wanted my truth back. That evening, as the sun went down, I walked to the park again, the same bench where I had cried weeks ago. But this time, I didn't cry, I smiled, because I realized something. Life had taken everything from me, but it had also given me something I never had before: clarity. Over the next few days, things started to move quietly. Mr. Ashby filed a cease and desist order to freeze any property changes. He sent notice to the local records office to flag any suspicious transfers. And he began gathering proof that Kayla, my daughter-in-law, had tampered with documents while I was in the hospital last year. Every call, every email, every letter brought me closer to the truth. And while Brandon and Kayla laughed in their stolen comfort, I was building something stronger, a case made of silence and facts. Then one afternoon, the phone rang. It was Brandon. "Mom," he said softly, "can we talk?" For a moment, I almost melted. That voice, the same one that once called me after his nightmares, after heartbreaks. But then I remembered that letter on the door, those 6 words. I took a deep breath and replied, "Brandon, I have nothing more to say. The law will speak for me now." He went quiet, and in that silence, I felt something powerful, not victory, but peace, because I finally realized I didn't have to beg to be heard anymore. A week later, a letter arrived from the court. The hearing was set. Martina came over that evening with tea, and we sat by the window like 2 old soldiers preparing for battle. "You're brave," she whispered. I smiled faintly. "No," I said, "I'm just tired of being quiet." Outside, the city lights flickered like fading stars. Inside, I opened my diary again, not to write about pain this time, but strength, the kind that grows in the dark when no one is watching. The day before the hearing, a knock echoed through my small apartment. I opened the door, and there he was, Brandon, standing in the rain, eyes full of regret. He whispered, "Mom, please, don't do this." I looked at him quietly, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see my son. I saw a man who had finally realized what he'd lost. Part 3. The last letter. He stood there, soaked in rain, his shoulders trembling under the weight of his own choices. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us felt heavy, like every unspoken word from the past 20 years had gathered in that silence. "Mom, I made a mistake," he whispered. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." His voice cracked, like a child who finally realized his mother's love had limits, not in depth, but in endurance. I looked at him, standing in that doorway, and part of me wanted to hold him again, tell him it was all right. But another part, the one that had been humiliated, forgotten, and betrayed, whispered quietly inside me, "No more." That night, I barely slept. I sat by the window, watching the rain trace silver lines down the glass. I kept hearing his voice echoing in my head, "Please, don't do this." But this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about truth, something that even love shouldn't destroy. I picked up my diary again, and began to write, not for him, but for me. Sometimes love means letting go, and sometimes it means standing tall when the people you love kneel in regret. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse. It was small, plain, not the grand halls of justice you see in movies. Just a quiet room with pale walls, a wooden bench, and a few strangers who would decide the fate of my life's work. Brandon and Kayla sat across from me. She avoided my eyes, her hands nervously twisting a ring. Brandon looked down, unable to meet my gaze. Mr. Ashby leaned toward me and said softly, "Remember, Mrs. Carter, you're not fighting for revenge. You're fighting for what's already yours." I nodded, because that's all it ever was. Not a battle, but a reclamation. When my turn came, I stood up slowly. My voice trembled at first, but I found strength in every word. I spoke of my husband, of the home we built, of the nights I spent alone, after being turned away from my own door. And when I finished, the judge simply said, "The property belongs to Mrs. Margery Elaine Carter. Any unauthorized transfer is hereby void." Just like that. Years of pain, erased in a sentence. Not with anger, not with vengeance, with justice. As we walked outside, Brandon came up to me. His eyes were red, wet with shame and something deeper, realization. "Mom," he whispered, "I don't deserve your forgiveness." I looked at him for a long moment. "You're right," I said quietly, "but I'll still pray for you. Because forgiveness isn't about who deserves it. It's about freeing your heart from the prison of pain." He lowered his head, tears falling onto the courthouse steps. And in that instant, I saw not the man who betrayed me, but the boy I once held, broken and lost. Weeks passed. The house was legally restored to my name, but I didn't return there. I sold it. Because that home wasn't home anymore, I moved into a small seaside cottage, quiet, warm, and full of light. Every morning, I sit by the window with my cup of tea, listening to the ocean breathe, and sometimes, when the wind carries a soft hum, I hear my husband's laughter in it. I write in my diary every night now, not about loss, but life, about how pain changes shape with time, and how even broken hearts can still bloom when they stop clinging to the past. Last week, a letter arrived. It was from Brandon. He wrote, "Mom, I hope one day you'll tell my children about the woman you are, because they deserve to know the kind of strength that built our name." I smiled as I folded the letter. Maybe one day, I'll tell them the truth, not to shame him, but to remind them that every generation carries both mistakes and redemption, because in the end, that's what life really is, a collection of unfinished apologies and the grace to forgive them. Final red hook, end of story. And as I close my diary tonight, I realize this isn't just my story. It's a story of every heart that has ever been broken.